Hi, I'm Rita Savasco. We're here today to talk about our product, Annotating Literary Elements. And I'm joined by my good friends and colleagues. On my right here is Tracy Molitor. Those of you may know that Tracy is a graphic designer in Rooted in Language, and she's part of the whole think tank behind what we do.
I like being called a think tank.
Yes,
I'll take that.
You're the entire think tank, correct? So Tracy, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
Tracy and I developed this together, but we did it with input and insight from Claire Molitors, who's a reading and writing tutor that works with me in my private practice. Claire has a degree in creative writing, and she also does graphic design and graphic arts herself. So thanks for joining me, Claire.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Claire also is the one you might hear from if you send questions to Rooted in Language, because she handles a lot of our administrative issues.
Yes, yeah, Claire has been awesome for that. So you want to remember that name, because she's the one who will help you solve our many problems that we seem to have come our way. So many of you have been using Annotating Literary Elements, and we have been wanting to talk about this with you, and we've gotten some comments and feedback, and we'd like to share some of our thoughts about why we did this and what our goals were in working with kids. So I thought we would just start with this general conversation of why do we at Rooted in Language think annotation is so important, and why do we think kids need help with it? So I thought, Tracy, you might want to start us off.
One of the things we constantly hit on at Rooted in Language is finding ways to get children to connect with text. So you're not just reading. You're not just decoding. You're actually engaging with the words on the page, and you're finding all of the many, many things that are available to find beneath the text. So annotating, the process of writing notes in the margin and interacting with the text physically as you read, reading with a pencil, we sometimes call it, is a very powerful tool to help children do that, or adults.
Right. And I get questions now and then, is this a response to some political agendas in the field of education? All of a sudden kids are needing to annotate more. The answer is no. I've been teaching this stuff for 30 plus years to kids. I feel like I'm glad that, more traditional education is starting to talk about it a little more, because this is a strategy I've been using for years to try to get kids to connect with text. That said, I see a lot of struggles in annotating, and Claire, maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the struggles we tend to see when kids trying to annotate and figure out how, why.
Yeah, a lot of it is that sense of when they just have no idea what it means in terms of, like, okay, you're told maybe in a school setting or while reading something that you'll annotate it, and therefore you'll understand it better and you'll have a richer connection with it. And they go, okay, great, that sounds awesome, and then stare at the book and have no idea what to actually do in terms of annotating. You also get where they're told they need to highlight things or write notes in the margins or something like that. And
Underline.
Yeah, do a lot of underlining. And you turn around and they've highlighted the whole page or the whole book because there's no sense of understanding what's actually the key piece of information or the important thing that you need to pull out of a particular passage or, out of a page.
Right, and they don't seem to really know how to mark text, what they're looking for. Sometimes teachers will say things like, write questions in the margin. Well, that's not the only way we annotate. We annotate key ideas, we annotate connected thoughts that we have. So we decided to break this down and teach annotation in the way we teach it when we work with kids. And part of the value of all this is we use some key strategies, and one of them is we use picture books. Right. So every time we do something, we like to start with a picture book, and we try to pick a picture book that we think will cross ages. So we pick something that all kids would like, K through 12. Tracy's my master at picking picture books. And Tracy, why did we pick the book that we picked to go with this this program, and what's the value of using a picture book to start?
Okay, well, let me back up just a little bit and say that in our curriculum, we divided it into 5 different sections, 4 of which are all about trying to organize for students and for the people teaching them. How do these various pieces of information that you're looking for within text, how can you categorize them so that it makes them a little simpler to learn?
Yes, and remember.
And remember.
Right? If we can put certain ideas in a basket, now you only have to hold, say, 4 baskets. Every
Right.
basket holds a lot of ideas, as opposed to these are the 50 things you should look for when you're annotating
right,
text.
which is just overwhelming. So the very first section is what we refer to as plot arc elements, which are the basic structural pieces that make a story. And that's any story. If you were telling a verbal story about what happened to you on your way to the bank that afternoon, you would use some of these basic elements to make the story interesting to your hearers. And that's what writers do when they write. So again, to try to make this concept more accessible for children, we love to use picture books as their first experience looking for plot arc elements.
Right.
Picture books are such a great tool because they're visual, so they're accessible to kids of all ages, and older kids enjoy them. They have fond memories of picture books when they were growing up, and they're always willing to dive back into one, at least in our experience.
Yes, and we try to pick, as I said, we try to pick ones that we know would appeal to teenagers. So this one in particular has aliens
Right.
that have landed in a house,
Right.
and
they encounter the family cat.
they encounter the family cat.
They're
And-
small. They're very small aliens.
They're very small aliens. And, we also we're discovering over the years, and we'll come back to this later, that even children's picture books are not simple stories
No,
the
not
way
anymore.
they used to be.
Not at
Right.
all.
And that's the thing, though, about picture books, is that they are microcosms of literature. They contain many, 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 sometimes all of the elements that you're looking for when you read a novel.
Right. And the problem with a novel is it is filled with multiple characters and multiple events and multiple high points and multiple low points. And everybody has a problem, even though it may not be the main problem.
Right.
Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and it can be really difficult. It's easy to get bogged down in a book.
Right.
So we wanted to kind of make everything like we talk about in Trees in the Forest, of trying to make things both visible and enjoyable.
Right. Yeah.
And we did that with a lesson that you can do in a one-time sit-down. Picture books are short.
Standard picture book is 32 pages long.
Yeah, right. I didn't know that. But they're short, and you could actually engage in plotting out the plot arc on that one book, and get that framework from this is what we're looking for, this is what we're working on.
All in one lesson, which
Right.
is great.
Right. So that's why we do it. And we use Post-it notes. Claire had said something earlier about the great thing about sticky notes is they're sticky in more ways than one. So Claire, why
Yeah.
don't you talk about that value a little bit?
Yeah, so sticky notes obviously being literally sticky because you can stick them to things. And I know we do a lot with that kind of visible and enjoyable concept where, we created a plot arc and our table isn't large enough, so let's stick it to the wall. So it kind of adds that level of playfulness to it, so you can just, stick it all over the windows and the walls and the floor, wherever you want it. As well as, there's a time-honored tradition of writing something down makes you remember it better. So that more metaphorical aspect of something being sticky, as in it sticks in your head. So I've experienced with my students that, we're discussing what characters are and what setting is and what all these different things mean. And it's kind of nebulous for them. It's kind of, a little wishy-washy. And then they actually write it down and they go through this process of putting pencil to paper, and suddenly they can explain to me what setting is,
Right.
from then on.
Right. And it gives a little more ownership. It's sticky in that way, so that if you're, plotting this out on, a long piece of paper or a wall or a table or, a science poster board, trifold board, if you're doing that, when you come and you're working with a bigger book, you come back to it later and it's stuck, right? You don't have to go through this big review of what did we say before. It puts the ownership back on the student that this is what I wrote, this is what I understood then. I may or may not agree with it anymore. I might want to add something. Another value of sticky note is you rip that one off and you write another one. So if you decide you're changing your mind on something, you can either get rid of a sticky note or you can begin to set them aside that this was a hypothesis that I had. Now I have this hypothesis, but I'm not ready to say that one was wrong. I'm going to set that one aside for a little bit. And so it's stuck. It's not gone. It's not like you're saying 2 weeks ago, what was that great idea you had about, and no one can remember because, life is busy and so on. So
they also are accessible, like picture books, in that they're small. So you can do bits and pieces of writing. And it doesn't overwhelm kids, especially those kids who struggle with writing. They can write a few words and they filled it up.
Right. If you're going to talk about something like what's the conflict, what's the theme, kids can feel like, well, I don't really know that I fully yet know what the theme is, but I have this little idea. Well, great. A sticky note, it invites the little idea.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be complete.
Absolutely.
And, you can be in process.
Yeah. I was going to say, too, that it sounds like we're, sponsored by Postit notes.
Yeah, it does.
But I love using different colors. We talked about, you can buy them in every color under the sun. And I color code stuff because I like the hyper-organization aspect of that. And I like to share that with my students, too, where we decide to put all the characters we're talking about on blue Post-it notes and all the, great quotes we find on green Post-it notes, and that kind of thing, so that it also makes it easy looking back at things where you go, oh, let's, flip through the book or look at the wall for all of the yellow things. And that means that we've discovered the symbols throughout the book or something like that.
Right. And we did color code our plot arc with that in mind, that you could match up those colors if you want. Another thing my students have done is many books today have multiple main characters, multiple perspectives, may in fact have multiple protagonists, and they've picked shades of colors to, represent this, this coral pink represents this character and this hot pink represents that, and the light pink is representing, the events in the story kind of thing.
Right.
So that's one of the ways that, you can also use these colors, and it adds a little bit of fun to it. But also, like you said, Claire, it brings kids back to, this idea that Tracy was talking about, that if you can hold ideas in a basket, there's not so many ideas anymore.
Right.
In terms of working memory, it's a lot more helpful, so that the color coding can give kids a way to kind of be grouping things in their mind for the future.
Absolutely.
So let's move on. Let's get started.
Okay.
It's interesting that plot arc, which most people would say, oh, my kids know that, has been one of the things that's raised the most questions. And I find, even with my own students, every time we have a new story, it's easy to really just be focused on plot arc because there's so much there, especially in the modern story. But Trace, so talk a little bit about how we set this up in our curriculum.
So we have created a general plot arc that we believe is usable for any story, any fictional, even non-fictional stories a lot of times follow a plot arc. So we tried to create these chunks of information that are found in every story. So we put them in what would be kind of a traditional or classic order. You have your introduction phase, and then you have your rising action, and you have your falling action, and you end up with a conclusion. So, and there are pieces within each of those stages. What you'll find in a lot of modern literature is that it doesn't necessarily come in that order, but the chunks are still there. The pieces that make up the plot arc are still in that story somewhere. The challenge is unearthing them and figuring out what they're doing for the story. What is their role in the plot arc? And hopefully the plot arc we've created allows you to do any narrative structure that you encounter. It's just some are more challenging than others.
Right, and they might look a little different, but we wanted to teach kids the basic foundational framework so that if they see variations off that, they understand what it's a variation of, right? We
Right.
wanted them to kind of have the basis so then they could
Right.
have those discussions. One parent said something about, we couldn't decide where to put this Post-it. Well, I think that's beautiful. My goal is not so much the answer of where to put that Post-it, but the process of having the debate of where to
Right.
put that Post-it teaches kids an awful lot about story structure and what the writer's doing, the
Yeah.
writer's style. So when you feel like, wow, I didn't know the answer to that, just know that you've probably engaged in great questions
Yeah.
and,
Right.
and have a hypothesis.
That your Post-its allow for that.
Right.
So what you think right now, you might change your mind in 5 chapters.
Yes.
Something might occur that says, oh, I don't think that was the crisis after all. I think this is the crisis. So you're free to move your Post-it somewhere else and create a new one.
And like you said, Rita, I mean, all it does is open the door. If you haven't already had that discussion, it opens the door for continuing to have a discussion about, expanding the view to why the writer chooses to do things. You're not so much focused on what's happening in the story, but why those decisions were made in the first place, which
Which is a really important point
Yeah.
because kids have got to make a shift from I'm retelling plot. That's what they think writing is retelling plot. They have to make a shift to analysis.
Right.
So by creating this method, all of that discussion, you're laying those juicy conversations. Julie Bogart likes to call them juicy conversations that kids need to have in order to engage in analytical writing. You're
Absolutely.
right. So Claire actually was our biggest source in creating this plot arc. She finished college a few years ago. She knows what everybody's talking about right now. A little more than Tracy and I, who did it, let's just say quite
more than a few years
a few decades ago. So Claire, tell them about this triangular model that you set up in
Sure.
our plot arc and why.
Yeah, I guess I can start with why, I guess, a little backwards. Because when we were initially discussing putting this stuff down, we had talked about sort of the basic formation of the plot arc. And one of my, I wouldn't say issues, I'm not sure how to describe it, one of my
Nagging.
yeah, just kind of this ongoing thought that, niggles the back of my head, is that, when in school, when I first learned about the plot arc, it was a very simplified sort of mountain shape, which is what is typically taught. But then as I got older and read, higher and higher literature and got into college, I started to realize that the plot arc is a little more complicated than that. It's bumpy and it's not clean, it's not straightforward. But nobody ever explained that to me. There was never any other model other than this sort of basic, go up one side, reach the top, come down the other side. And so the more complex view of it was never shown to me. So I wanted to approach it in a way that you can see it as a simplified mountain, because that is a legitimate way of, approaching the plot arc, but also that there are these other pieces in there that are equally important as understanding going up one side and coming down the other.
Probably the most important.
Yeah, and I'd argue that they're maybe more important. And that's these kind of 3 main explodey points, I guess, this triangle of action, I guess. The first of which being the spark event. So, in the beginning of a story, you have the introduction, which can last anywhere from, in a picture book, it can be a page.
It could be a square.
It could be a square, yeah. You're reading something that has, panels in it. It's just, whoop, there it is.
One panel.
Yeah. It might establish where you are, who you are, the overall tone or mood of the story. In a book, by like Tolstoy, it might be 300 pages of introduction. So you get, it varies, obviously. But inevitably you come across this initial sort of explosion that I call the spark event, that is the push out the door. It's the thing that actually gets the ball of action rolling It's the reason that you have an adventure. It's the reason your protagonist becomes the protagonist, or your antagonist becomes the antagonist. In some stories, we're kind of talking about it is literally a push out the door,
The Hobbit.
Yeah, in The Hobbit. Well, The Hobbit's a little gentler, I guess. But yeah,
Right.
Gandalf comes to Bilbo and says, you need to get out. You've been sitting around too much. You're lazy. Go have an adventure. And that's the spark event. That's the moment of, I will step out my door and have an adventure. Sometimes
You never know where the
Right,
road
you
will
never
lead
know.
you, right?
Sometimes the spark event is a little more violent, particularly in adventure stories where you have some town gets attacked by the dragon, kind of thing, and our hero emerges, right?
You were talking about Beowulf.
I was talking about Beowulf, how Grendel comes and attacks the main hall, and that is what causes everyone to realize we need a hero because we have a villain, and so that's the spark event, and that's the one pillar, the one triangle, corner of the triangle.
But spark events can be difficult to find. And
Yes.
one of our users said that her son in particular had a difficult time identifying the spark event. And I think just to look at this in a way that can be more helpful, I think it's important, don't skip the picture book. They
Right.
did.
Right.
And also spend time talking about these familiar stories and familiar movies and just really ponder, what do you think was the spark event? We actually spent some time here prior to taping this having all this discussion around spark event. I mean, you could have a lot of different theories going, and you actually don't want to just go look it up.
Right.
What you want is the conversation and the theories.
Right. One of the methods I will use sometimes is to just kind of dive into listing events sometimes. Like, let's just talk about what happens toward the beginning of the story. The protagonist goes here and does this thing, or he fights back against, whatever it might be, or, just kind of talking about and listing these things until sometimes, and a lot of times the student is the one who goes, hey, wait, that seems more important, or that seems, we wrote more about that event, or
Yeah, I agree.
we talked more about that one, or there was an important object that came up in that, and so a lot of times it comes from the child, from the student, about, maybe, we're leaning a little more heavily toward that Post-it note being our spark event, rather than just a sort of introduction event, that happens.
Right. The other thing that can happen is a student might think that a certain character is the protagonist, so they start to recognize, a conflict occurred from that spark event, because that's a byproduct of this spark. But then later they may decide, I think I was wrong. I'm not sure I think that was I shouldn't say wrong, but I think I now think it's this character who's the protagonist, and they had this conflict, and for that character, I think this is the spark event. So I don't want you to feel like just because we have it on the plot arc, it looks
Looking very clean.
Yeah, it looks very clean and static. It can be very changeable as you're progressing in a story.
Absolutely.
Because you may learn information that changes your mind. There may be a flashback that occurs later in the story that tells you what the real spark event was in this character's life, and you didn't know that in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's one piece in our triangular look.
One
Claire.
corner. The next one, I guess chronologically, moving up the sort of rising action mountain there, is the what I call the crisis, or the crisis moment, crisis event, the sort of this point in the story where the protagonist has reached their lowest point. So the nadir would be kind of that literary term.
Spell that, Claire.
That's Nadir, the nadir. Yes, opposite of the crest, right? You have the peak being the highest, the nadir being the lowest, emotionally, metaphorically.
And I always think of that as Mount Doom, kind of a joke. If you know the trilogy story, Mount Doom is such a perfect picture of the crisis moment.
It really is. Yeah, you've got, of course, it's a big, black, gloomy mountain and explosions. It's very sad.
Inside it looks like hell.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
And with that you have, Frodo's lowest moment where he doesn't think he can climb the mountain. He can't actually destroy the ring. You know, he is starting to honestly believe that he won't succeed at all, right? And this is a true sort of heartbreak moment.
And Sam becomes the hero.
Yeah, he does. And that kind of, that moves on to another point. But in terms of just the crisis, so it's this low point. It's this maybe recognition of failure on the part of the hero. And then usually progresses like that, like with Lord of the Rings, very smoothly into a turning point. So you transition from that point of our triangle, that pillar, to the climax being the next pillar. And a lot of times they happen right on top of each other, which can make them difficult to distinguish and difficult to say, oh, that's actually the crisis and that's the climax. But if we keep using Lord of the Rings as our example here, the moment where Frodo believes he, has reached the end of the line, and Sam is the one to turn it around and pick him up and carry him up there. And that gives Frodo the ability and the strength to believe in himself again and then go rushing forward. And
reminds him of where he came from
Right.
and who he is, and leads you to this discovery that you can have more than one protagonist.
Yes.
And they can have more than one conflict.
Absolutely.
And they can have more
More than one
people
crisis.
than just one who has a crisis and grows from that crisis.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, when you're deep into a novel, you start making more Post-it notes, right?
Yeah, no, there's Post-it notes going everywhere. So then the with regard to the climax is typically categorized by there's a high point of action, the highest point of action frequently, and a change in the main character. So you have that turning point at the crisis, but then an actual, maybe emotional, maybe psychological change that the main character or whatever protagonist you've chosen to follow undergoes. So, we're still kind of talking about Lord of the Rings. If you switch over to Aragorn as the protagonist, he undergoes a climax where he realizes that he really is the king, right? And he's the true leader that he was born to be. And his crisis and climax happen way earlier in that story. Where
That's right. He has a crisis a climax much
earlier,
right?
yeah. And he finally, he gets the sword that's been forged for him. Good indication that that there's a climax because he has the tool that really serves that purpose.
We were talking about this difficulty of recognizing spark events or even climaxes because sometimes it looks like action. And it's easier for kids to recognize, oh, there was an action. Sometimes it's inaction.
Right.
And the inaction is a decision. It could be the spark. It could create a crisis. Mm-hmm. It could be that moment of inaction, which may, in fact, make a change. I was mentioning the book Thief Lord. Mm-hmm. When you get to this crisis moment in Thief Lord, there's two main characters, and you could argue over who you want to have as the main character in your writing of your paper. And by the way, I use that idea all the time. Which one do you want to say you think is the protagonist? Can you support that? I don't care which one of these two characters. But in this moment, one of the character responds with action and has one outcome. Mm-hmm. The other character decides not to engage and has a different outcome. And those two outcomes still were important decisions those characters made, and it was decisions that changed them and grew them. So you have good argument for both characters, Absolutely. And you have good argument that it's a climax for each of them, but it doesn't always look like action. And that's an important thing to know.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Also important to note the two different hypotheses you were talking about is quite common. And as your kids get older and they start to be at a college level, that gets applauded a lot more. If you can come up with an alternate hypothesis and support it through the text, that's a very valuable skill.
Yes. In fact, they do not want to know what everybody thinks. They want to know that you are able to come up with some different kind of analysis. And I love to tell this story that my daughter took a Jane Austen class as an English major in college, And so everyone in the class had, lived and breathed Jane Austen their whole life. Who else would take a Jane Austen class? And they were all assigned a paper where they had to do some sort of analysis on Jane Austen that had never been done before. I mean, she wanted to pull her hair out. I mean, this is someone who's been studied and written about for hundreds of years. And somehow she was supposed to come up with something different.
Right.
Well, what's different is your take on it, your analysis of it, your look at it, your, dare I use the word lens?
Yeah, your lens, yeah.
So, so all of this debate is really helpful for kids.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking too, we talk about you're studying a piece of literature and then you kind of zoom out to be able to write about that literature. If you keep zooming out even more about this, how does this actually apply to the larger concept of my life, kind of if we can get there with it, the ability to look at a situation and apply your own interpretive abilities to something and your own ability to take all these pieces of information and wrap them up in your own wrapping paper and do something with your own flair and from your own lens with it is a hugely valuable just life skill. I mean, this is what businesses look for and just being able
marriages.
Right, yeah. Being able to problem solve, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's...
Right. It's growth. That's what growth looks like. And we talk about character growth, but we, as Shakespeare says, all the world's a stage and we're the players upon it. Our own growth is something we have to be able to look at. Too.
But that whole previous discussion should free you up as an educator to not be a slave to, oh my gosh, we have to find the crisis.
Right.
We have to find the climax. There's a right answer here. Many times the right answer is the one you can support.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you mean don't think there's a right answer.
Right.
You feel like there's a right answer.
Think, the right answer is relative to your interpretation and what you found within the text to support that.
As long as you're comprehending, sometimes, I like to say don't feel like there's only, a right answer, one right answer. I mean, you do have to generally be comprehending the story. You can get waylaid if you're not comprehending. But in general, as long as you're comprehending it, and you have an idea and you can support it, that's what a good paper is made of. One of the things that I think was really enlightening for me when I added Claire's piece of this Spark event is, as I was talking with students, this past summer, everybody has their summer reading assignments. Everybody was creating plot arcs with, Post-it notes. And when we started to talk about theme, a lot of my students really struggle with what is the theme? How do I verbalize theme? Can I find quotes that would support a theme? They have difficulty with all of that. And I found when I took those 3 Post-its off, those triangular Post-its that Claire was talking about.
The spark event, the crisis, and the climax.
Right. When we would just, that's another value of Post-it notes, right? Or the sticky notes is we just pulled those off, put them on a new piece of paper and looked at them. Just those 3. Put them in a triangle, looked at them. All of a sudden, my students would say, and they'd start verbalizing what they wrote on one, what they wrote on another, what they wrote on another, and they'd say, oh, you think the theme is, and out would come the beginning of, being able to understand theme. Yeah. And that is a hard concept to teach kids who struggle with more abstract thinking. And so this is a way you've taken something very concrete now. They've written their words on these 3 little sticky notes, and from that concrete look, you can begin to see something abstract.
Yeah. I think it's a difficult concept to teach anybody. I mean, I remember going, in middle school, high school, we'd read a book, and we're reading great literature, right? But we're told, okay, what's the theme, or what's a theme? And everybody just kind of looks at their desk. Like, I don't know, maybe, and then somebody throws out, okay, we're reading To Kill a Mockingbird. Mockingbirds are the theme because it's in the title, and they have no concept, and like, okay, maybe they are.
Don't kill mockingbirds.
Right, don't kill mockingbirds. And it's like, well, why do you say that? Well, I don't know. So it's, I think a lot of people struggle with just understanding theme in general.
Right. So this leads us down two paths of conversation. So we have two more things to talk about here. One is, let's take a book like To Kill a Mockingbird that follows the traditional plot arc. And then let's talk about what's happening in literature now when we're not following the typical pattern. So To Kill a Mockingbird basically follows the typical pattern.
yeah.
But what's the conundrum that we see with kids when they're trying to use this information and analyze To Kill a Mockingbird?
Well, one of the big things that I encounter is their difficulty in figuring out who the protagonist-antagonist is. So, a lot of people think, that maybe Scout's the protagonist because it's told from her perspective, whereas others might argue that Atticus is the protagonist because, this sort of main storyline of the whole trial and the injustice of the society surrounds him. And then the third being maybe that Jem is the protagonist because he very obviously goes through a coming of age, growing older life cycle.
Right. Right. And so, we have some choices here. We can open up some, supportive piece of text and say, the answer is this.
Right.
Right? Or we can say to kids, okay, well, let's play this out.
Right.
If Atticus is the protagonist, what's his crisis? What's the crisis event? What's his conflict? What's his spark event? What's his conflict? What's the crisis moment? What was the climax? Did he undergo any kind of transformative change?
Right.
If it's Jem, how about that?
Same thing. Yeah.
If it's Scout, how about that? Now, at the end of all that, if a student has supportive evidence, why would I stop them from saying it's Jem? I don't actually think it's Jem. I think you're pretty hard-pressed to maybe make that case. But if you can make that case, you now are thinking at a level that colleges are actually
Absolutely.
looking for.
Yeah.
The other question that I like to ask, too, is who is their antagonist?
That's the other piece,
Yeah,
right?
where
Very
And
important
talk
piece.
about the various kinds of antagonists.
Right. That sometimes an antagonist might be, the dragon attacking the town, right? Where it's a very obvious, or it's the evil villain, wahaha, and you're going to fight them.
Darth Vader.
Yeah, Darth
Right.
Vader in the big black suit, very obvious antagonist figure. And other times, and particularly in To Kill a Mockingbird, a lot of the antagonists are concepts or constructs that are, Scout is horrified by injustice, right? She hates injustice, and she spends...
And the role of females.
Yeah, right. And
well,
how...
also an injustice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But let's not go
No,
there.
no.
But so she spends a lot of the book fighting that as her antagonist.
And what's interesting there is, you can kind of envelope all of that in the big antagonist is society.
Right.
And what is interesting about that, though, is to begin to look at, well, in what ways was society making some shifts? Was there any hope for it? Did you see it in these characters who represented society? And so then when you look at who is society in To Kill a Mockingbird, who are those characters and what kind of representation were they?
Sure.
Were they someone who was narrow-minded and made no changes? Were they someone who wanted to see change but wasn't brave enough to do it?
Right.
Were they someone who was just wanted to be a champion standing behind Atticus?
Way behind.
Or even right behind, like
Right.
Miss Maudie, who's
Right.
definitely a support person
Right.
for him, but wasn't out there herself because of her views
Yeah.
on her own role in that. Is it someone like Aunt Alexandra, who suddenly makes this statement where you're going, whoa,
What?
Like, you actually had kind of a moment there, know? So all of that becomes very meaningful.
Sure, and it becomes kind of a mini history lesson going on there too, because I had one student who's reading it and was understanding a lot of what was going on, but then at the same time was sort of baffled by a little bit of the interfamilial reaction or interactions going on, and by the societal behavior. So explaining Deep South Depression era, it's it's hugely important to the events that play out in that book. And it's, it's kind of a mini history lesson on just a brief,
Right.
this is what it was like in that time period.
But that's why she wrote it,
Right.
you know? Yeah, and as you were saying, when you can take that perspective where you're stepping back like that, all of a sudden you're analyzing writer's style
Yeah.
and writer's choices. And that's the kind of writing, the analytical writing we want to see. I see this all the time. I'll have junior high.
If I could interject, just as for the people listening, we've been talking all about the first section, which is plot arc elements. The last section of the curriculum is writer's style.
Yes,
another
we
very
really
difficult
get to it.
area.
We
but
take
yes.
you all the way through before we get to this idea of some of the components of writer's style. But by then, you've really built up a lot,
Right.
in your toolbox about what the writer is doing and
Understanding
being able
the
to say
writer's
that.
choices.
What
Sure.
I was going to say, what I see right now for kids, and not just in traditional education, but in homeschool co-op situations where they're being assigned these papers, they will get an assignment. I want an analytical paper on writer's style. Nobody even knows what that means.
No
What does
idea.
that mean? They don't know what to write about. Well, by the time you do this, you're going to have a really good sense
Oh my God.
of what you would write
You're going to have a
about.
whole stack of Post-it.
many. Yeah, then it'll be, what do you pick? Right? The last thing is this idea that in modern literature, the plot arc is all over the map. And why don't you just talk about that a little bit, Claire?
Sure. Real quick, though, I would argue that while we do have a lot of a huge, since storytelling first started, there is sort of this plot arc structure that is very traditional and very straightforward. But there have been pockets in history where writers kind of decide to wander off into weird narrative structure land. So it isn't just a reflection of modern literature, too. I just think it's
Nice.
an interesting point.
Yes, it is an interesting
I
point.
always bring up Frankenstein, which is not a modern piece of writing,
True.
but it's told in a style that's called a frame narrative. So the beginning and the ending take place at the same time.
Yeah.
The-
Circular, yeah.
Yeah, it's circular. The center of the story does follow more of that. Okay, here's the introduction, spark event, crisis, climax, falling action, conclusion. And all of a sudden, when you reach the conclusion, you go, wait, I've read this already, because it was the introduction.
Oh, yeah. Right.
So it's just kind of a neat, this is not a piece I don't think anyone would categorize as modern literature.
Yeah,
and yet
right.
it
Nice point.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice point. It's interesting because our book club tonight is talking about a novel called A Gentleman in Moscow, and I was reading a writer's interview, and he wrote that entire thing in what he called a diamond structure,
Okay.
which he starts at this critical point of going through a revolving door, and then he moves through time in increasing, doubling increments. So it's 2 days, then 4 days, then so many weeks,
And
then
then he
so
gets
many
up to a
months,
year,
and then so
then
many
it's-
years,
yes.
and then all that starts,
And
and
then
then
it
it all
comes
starts
back together.
folding back down again.
That's really cool.
And yeah, it was just
It's
like,
a great book, by
yeah,
the way.
it is. It's a really good book. So, there's all kinds of cool things happening, and it's easy to get excited about it when you really start seeing it
Sure.
in that way. So we were talking about some modern things some modern stories out there that are showing some of these different plot structures, and it brings up the topic of time jumping or flashbacks.
Flashbacks,
So
yeah.
tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Flashbacks, when they happen in a story, you have time moving in a certain direction, and then all of a sudden we're transported to a different period in time. And sometimes it can be a day ago, sometimes it can be 400 years ago. But it happens in the past, hence flashback. So they happen all over the place. Sometimes some stories actually start with flashbacks, which is kind of interesting. But they're usually meant as anchor points, I guess is a good way of describing them, where you understand something about a character that's being told, and all of a sudden we go through a flashback and we understand something slightly different about a character. So it kind of anchors them through time, and they can serve to completely alter your opinion of something, or to subtly shift your perception of either how the events are unfolding or why a character is behaving a certain way. And they can be really confusing.
And they can be their own story.
And they can be their own story.
And in fact, the short story we picked
Yes.
Starts in a moment.
Right.
It tells an entire flashback story, goes back to that moment, and then tells another story. And I had a student who was trying to figure out how to create that plot arc, and she created a plot arc that was like one little mountain and then a bigger mountain. And I thought, that's pretty brilliant, you know? Because where do you put the flashback
Right.
Post-it?
Right.
Is
Right.
there a right answer to where to put the flashback Post-it?
No, I don't think there is. Of course, it depends on the story. Because, and here you get into more discussions about writer style. They happen all the time. Is why you would put it somewhere. So, you know, maybe we're moving through a story where right after the crisis, we have this flashback moment. If I were plotting it out, I would probably put that Post-it right there, right after the crisis, and talk about no matter what that flashback is going to, whether it's, you know, before the introduction or right before the crisis, wherever it sends you, the reason it's put right there is what's worth discussing. So
It
why
might explain conflict.
Right, yeah. Why do we suddenly need to know this thing about this character right before the climax? Or what does it say about where the climax is headed that we learned it, you know, at this exact moment?
Maybe it explains their reaction to that particular
Right,
crisis.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I tend to be in favor of putting the Post-it where it happens, not chronologically within the story, but chronologically page number wise, if that makes sense. So
And I would say sometimes it's good to kind of let kids move them chronologically.
Yeah.
And then after moving them chronologically, let them rethink it and put them elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So they might need that. They might need to just, if your child struggles with sequencing events, you might want to move them into chronological order because they may need that. It's confusing to them if you don't have it. I was talking about, we just went to see the movie Dunkirk, and that movie is all time jumping. And what was hard is it took me a few minutes to like figure out that's what was happening. I'd think, wait a minute, that what they would do is they would overlap scenes, and that was their first way of letting you know that's what they were doing. I almost found that harder than a book. I find it easier,
Right.
you know, in reading to realize I'm in a flashback. Sometimes in a visual movie, especially if it's this same moment in time in the same airplane, wearing the same clothes. Right? There's nothing about the way the scene looks, except now the plane is in a different place on the ocean in the English Channel than it was before.
Right. The
And I'm
waves have a
thinking,
different
yeah,
shape.
right. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. He was over that boat. Now he's coming to that boat. Is that another boat? I mean, so, you know, it can be tricky.
it can be very tricky.
Yeah, so
Very
you might need to order it
Yeah.
first before
Yeah.
you can figure out why it's there.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, we were talking about the book All the Light
the
You
Light,
Cannot
yeah.
See. And what's going on in that book, Trace?
That is a book that opens in the crisis. So you're smack dab in the middle of the crisis from page 1. And then it time jumps all over the place and keeps coming back to the crisis as kind of a touch point.
And it has two main characters.
It has two main characters who are, on the face of things, would be a protagonist and antagonist, but you kind of realize they're not. They're both going through the same thing imposed by a war. So they're both protagonists, and they both go through their own changes. And it's a fascinating book to read for that reason.
Right. You know, I think our point in this whole discussion is, number one, that we put in the lesson we have there for a reason. It's easy to just go, oh, I get it. Use Post-its. Let's do that with the
Right,
book we
jump
have
right
now.
in.
And I don't have time to go to the library and get this other book. But I do want to express to you that we have found that it's helpful for kids to actually go through this more visible, more enjoyable structure first that we've given you, and then from there take it to the more complex.
Right. And if you
literature.
need to, get more picture books.
Oh yeah,
And,
right.
and do it more than
Do
once.
Disney stories.
Sure,
Yeah,
do
yeah.
Disney movies.
Yeah, the
A great,
Disney movies.
great plot arc development in
Right.
Disney
Yeah,
movies.
they really are.
Yeah, we were kind of quizzing each other. We'd name a movie, and then everyone would have to say, what was the crisis, you know? So I think that kind of play that we were doing with each other is a great thing to be doing. The other thing is to really recognize that, this is pretty deep stuff we're talking about here.
Absolutely.
We're talking about,
Look how
all
long
of-
we've been blathering on.
I know. We're talking about your child's entire school career,
Right. And
so
beyond.
and your own. I mean, I feel like as a homeschool parent, I learned things that I had never known before. I mean, we're continuing to grow ourselves, right? So don't feel like there's one right answer. Recognize, all of this discussion is the value, and you're going to get something different out of every book. It's going to show you something new. There'll be
Absolutely.
something to say.
Yeah, give yourself permission to not know the answers and to work through it with your kids.
Right. It's a good one to end on. Great. All right. Thank you, Tracy and Claire. It's been a
Thank
great
you.
discussion.
Thank you.
Absolutely.